So this is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie, and I am making this recording in the evening with the night, with the darkness, and so I'm taking to calling these recordings nocturnes. And so this is the first in a series of nocturnes, and it's not as if I have anything planned out specifically. You know, I sort of work with the belief that what I'm doing here has to work itself out from the inside out. And so I suppose that what I'm doing is ultimately getting better at pursuing philosophy, which is in many ways not content in itself, but a methodology. And so what I mean is that one doesn't simply ascertain a set of beliefs or even theories that are in themselves philosophical. What one does actually is to ask questions, to challenge presuppositions, and to attempt to undo the hidden ideas that in many ways are determining our perceptions and our actions. And so I can't help but, in lieu of that, I can't help but, speak from the heart, because it's from that place where, the imagination begins to shape things. And, of course, at the beginning of every recording, there's a certain hesitation in me as I adjust to speaking for someone else, and that's someone else being you. And so as I find my rhythm and find my footing, and as I reflect and attempt to turn that reflection into something meaningful, I begin to reflect that this isn't merely open-ended. There are a few things that I was wanting to say, and those are that there's nothing inherently meaningful in experience in itself, and that in itself can seem depressing, in the sense that there's a realization that I think many people make, which is that you realize that there's no inherent value or meaning in the world in itself. And there are a lot of ways of saying this, but ultimately, philosophically, it's understood to be a way of being in the world that has ultimately drained everything of its theological meaning, which had hitherto held together a kind of constructed narrative that gave value and meaning almost automatically to experience, so that even questioning that meaning is out of touch with the reality of it. And so, to many people, when you begin with, if someone had taught you, or you're born into the belief in some kind of transcendental experience or some kind of divine intervention, or that there's some explanation for everything, it will of course appear to be a little dour to confront someone or to talk to someone who doesn't subscribe to that. It's no wonder in relation that if someone says that there's no inherent meaning to things or to life, that it automatically means that they're disenchanted, or that they lack imagination, or that they're not amazed by how wondrous life really is. And so you have a lot of people that, I think without realizing it, are reacting against something because of what they already believe, and yet what they're not really questioning is whether they even really understand what they're speaking out against. And a part of that understanding has to do with seeing that actually what we call reality is not neutral either. So it's not the other way. So it's not as if there was some barrier between you and the world wherein you are simply being pushed around and life is meaningless, because there's a number of cliches that come with the sudden discovery that we are bodies, and that we are animals, and that we live in a physical world, and that we don't have access to anything outside of this world, and that on a certain level our desire for certainty is curtailed by the fact that we may not even be asking the right questions. So I think that in many ways there are passages in philosophy that are very helpful at this time. And it's funny how you can study something in philosophy or read it, and 20 years later it will suddenly have profound value to you in spite of how arcane it appeared at the time of its discovery. And one of those things for me is Nietzsche's injunction that the nihilism or nihilism, you can call it whatever you want, the feeling of meaninglessness can be interpreted or can be approached in a multitude of ways. There's no single path in any of this. And in fact, what Nietzsche's injunction is in many ways it forces us to ask a question: how much of the abyss can we stare into? And by abyss, I mean the meaninglessness of things. But that's one way of asking it, because Nietzsche effectively asked, how do you know that you're not going to become a monster when you're dealing with monsters? Or if you see yourself as being attuned to this dark reality, how much of this darkness can you sustain before you yourself become dark? I can say that having had certain jobs and being around certain groups of people, you may identify a certain way, but you'll find that you're ultimately swallowed whole by the enormity of the people that you're around. And so on a certain level, you have to be able to question that and reorient yourself so that you can find a way out of it. And the thing about Nietzsche and his question as to how much darkness and how many monsters we can endure before we become it is also only half of the equation, because the other half of this Nietzschean injunction to me is that one cannot function without what Nietzsche calls useful errors. And of course, useful errors would be a good name for a band, but it's also Nietzsche's attempt to offer an affirmative epistemology, because the closest that Nietzsche comes to he does in many ways, but I think it's important that if you bring Nietzsche into this, that you see the corollary, which is that the man, as Nietzsche would say, is a bridge, and it's a passage. And so I think of these passages in works as being passages in themselves, and so hence the moniker middle child, because it's through these passages that I move. And a part of my own thinking, a lot of this sounds stupid complicated because I'm working it out as I go, and so I can't just stay at home and not write and not try to speak, because I don't know what I'm going to say before I say it, if you know what I'm saying. And so a lot of what I'm suggesting is complicated, because I suppose that for the first time I'm standing up on that stage like someone who's trying to play jazz. And a lot of what I'm doing is rooted in that idea that thinking is musical, and that there's a performative, inherently performative element of philosophy. And so that means that I, in the back of my mind, am very cognizant of all the errors in what I say. But nonetheless, I have to also push forth a little bit of arrogance, enough arrogance as to almost trick myself into believing what I need to believe. And hence, in many ways, this is what Nietzsche means by the useful error. And so why do I speak of this? I speak of this because of the theme that I'm sensing that's in my bones. And it has to do with doing what I really love to do, which is to take walks and read and to write and to do very simple things like exercise and cooking. And a part of that rhythm in a life that is sort of set in a rhythmical pattern is that you can start paying attention, because the beauty of having a routine, in spite of it might appearing to be conformist or appearing to be too rigorous, is that you free yourself to begin paying attention. And a part of what I really love about taking walks at night is that there's something that seems to circulate in me, almost as if I were a part of this city that I've come to love so much. And I don't know how long I'll be here, but I live in a part of the city that is like my own ventricles. And this is, of course, a city that goes north and south. And to me, they're like veins in a pumping heart. And this pumping heart is in the middle of the Midwest. And I know that sounds stupid, sentimental, but what I mean to elucidate is the theme within what I'm saying. Because speaking of jazz, speaking of rhythms, there's a sense in which I'm attempting to work out this theme. And this theme is rooted in the pleasure of walking. Because I've been walking for a very long time now. You know, when I was a kid, I would leave the house and go on walks. And I think I began at that time a kind of rhythm that would ground me on an existential level over time. And by grounding me, I mean psychically grounding me in the earth, almost as if, although I'm moving on 2 feet, it's this movement itself that seems to activate whatever parts of my own psyche that need to be activated. And so I also find that a lot of my own reflection is in rhythm of the streets where I walk. And I suppose that what I mean to say is that when you are walking during the day, like I have for so long, and walking in the sunlight, as I have now for like 4 years, 5 years, you find that it's easy to forget your roots. And my roots are in the nighttime walking. And that's why I call this recording Nocturne, because to me there's something so enchanting about nighttime. And I know I'm avoiding the cliche. I'm trying to be as fresh as I can in my language to avoid the cliche, but I can't avoid one from time to time. And there's something about walking at night that you find is thematic in art and music and cinema. For instance, you have the movie Taxi Driver, which I just so happened to catch a glimpse of recently. And I noticed that it's very indicative of what you have to call an existential theme in America, because it's quite clear that the book is influenced by other kinds of disfigured leads that are found in French literature, specifically Jean-Paul Sartre's book, The Stranger, which I found out later did have an influence on, I think it was Paul Schrader who made Taxi Driver. And it's a theme that, having walked at night for a very long time, it's a theme that I'm really familiar with. Because I think I'm one of those people who has this strange, stupid belief that you can change over time, or that you can grow over time, or that life isn't a journey. And I'm not sure if I believe any of that anymore, but it has certainly been a part of what I've become. And with that in mind, I can't help but notice the way in which I experience the city so differently from when I began walking it at night some 20 years ago, when I moved to the city. And over time, as I've evolved within, everything's come to have on a new meaning. And so I suppose that, having not walked at night for a while, I'm suddenly struck by how enchanting it is, as opposed to how it's represented in Taxi Driver. Because, you know, in Taxi Driver, everything is represented as being something that is expressive of what, in 200,000 literary mouths, has been represented to be one of angst, one of depression, as if we were the victims of some historical force. And of course, I'm not so American as to not be aware of my own being American, meaning that I'm not so blind to the fact that my own belief that one can, quote unquote, overcome depression, or that one can see through the darkness in the name of some optimism or some great overcoming. I mean, Jesus, I'm no Tony Robbins, and there's none of that in me. In fact, it's probably apt for another video, but I consider myself to have a tragic conception of things. But even that doesn't mean anything insofar as it sounds like something that is different from what I mean it to be. And so I suppose the point of these recordings is to further expand upon these underlying themes in my own thinking. And so I'm using Taxi Driver as a platform for thinking about how a person might change or shift. Because, speaking of Jean-Paul Sartre, and speaking of the existential, we could ask, is that even real existentialism? Like, is Taxi Driver or that book Nausea, is that existentialism? And I use those as examples for something that is, in many ways, it comes out of our romantic lineage, but it's also a part of our current condition. And it's one that, it's a language that gives us an apparent understanding of an experience that I am here challenging, because I don't think it's the real existential. I think that I'm certainly not the first one to point out that, Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism is a bastardized version of Martin Heidegger's existentialism. And there's a famous feud between these two thinkers, one being a German ontologist, phenomenologist, the other being a French existentialist, and that tension had to do with ultimately the fact that Jean-Paul Sartre, and I'm like fumbling up my words, Jean-Paul Sartre, I feel like Sweetie at the VMAs. No, I'm just kidding. Jean-Paul Sartre had Cartesianized Heidegger. And so what effectively happened is that the French absorbed what's called phenomenology from the Germans, except they placed over it their own inherently French Cartesian form of thinking. And the reason that I'm being super obtuse about this, like stupidly obtuse, is because there's a point. And the point is that to think that walking at night meant that you're feeling like the sadness of things, or that in many ways being what we are, like ultimately the progenitors of perhaps a mistake that we made as a species some 14,000 years ago, doesn't mean anything at all. And that's kind of the first part that I brought up originally, because a part of what makes me existential is that I place an emphasis on that autonomy, that I still subscribe to, I think, what is derivatively called the humanist tradition. And in subscribing to it, I don't mean to say that it's a set of beliefs that I arrived at vis-a-vis some rational process, but that it's a reflection of my own temperament, in other words, what you could call American optimism, which I challenge, is also expressive of my own temperament. And so I suppose that what I recognize is that ultimately is that, and God help us, I don't know if this is true, but very little of what we believe is actually arrived at through a rational process. Not that rationality isn't paramount in objective thinking. It's ultimately extremely limiting in terms of recognizing the underlying profundity in what's called phenomenology, which is not the same thing as the Cartesian. And the phenomenology, whether it's in Heidegger or others, is a kind of approach that doesn't necessarily advocate for what I'm advocating. In fact, there's a kind of determinism in Heidegger. There's a kind of determinism in a lot of in that kind of thinking. And that's why I point out the fact that I have my roots are in the existential and the humanist tradition. And so I understand that I appear to be very naive to all other thinkers in my my grounding in that. But I think what I mean to say is that what we're returning to, or what I want to return to, aren't ideas in themselves. In fact, I think the entire thing about subjectivity is hugely overrated. And so I'm so terrified that I still have that clicking noise that I had in my last recording, and so I keep hesitating. But I think the thing is that when you effectively learn how to chill out and you practice philosophy effectively, or you practice the philosophical method of your choice in a certain way, it ultimately helps you not to build up ideas or to construct theories, but ultimately, in many ways, what we think of as analysis or deconstruction has to do with not replacing ideas with other ideas, but allowing life itself to come spilling forth. And so, not to try to say too many things at once, but what I think of as the aesthetic is ultimately in the senses. And so when I say aesthetic, I do mean aesthesis, and I do mean the senses, but I also mean art. And I also mean that there's a sense in which we are in situations that, using Heidegger's word, we're thrown into. And there's a certain, what he calls facticity, which is that there's a certain reality that we're born into and then we make sense of. And there's also a sense in which that ties into what I was suggesting earlier about temperament and personality, that I could be born into it. So that's, in itself a real philosophical question. To what degree are we rational agents? To what degree are we ultimately even capable of challenging that which we are, perhaps? And so that's the question that I don't have a resolution to, but I think the question itself is really important. And I think that what we call, or what I want to call, dialectical thinking is my own version of dialectical thinking, and it has to do with playing on those kind of tensions rather than resolving them. And in fact, what I think of as philosophy is crucial to any horizontal society that is attempting to form relations that aren't based on domination. And it's not as if I believed in any kind of utopia, but I do believe that in the immediate world, there is something like an ethical ontology. And you could call it love, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but there is a sense in which there's an opening, and that opening isn't ideational. That opening is the withering of semiosis, in the sense that life itself, in its most objective reality, comes to take on a fullness of plenitude, of meaning, of resonance, and value. And of course, explaining what I even mean by that is going to take another 600 days of recording. And so I suppose I've at least gotten over that hump of being afraid to say what I think. I've been holding back for a very long time, and it's also because I couldn't speak until I figured out what I thought. And in the last couple of years, I sort of have, quote unquote, not figured out what I think, but figured out the dominant themes in my thinking and the questions in my thinking. And those are the ones that I attempt to elucidate in these recordings. And knowing that I'm putting these recordings out there gives me the huge advantage of more attentively hearing myself speak. And so I've been doing these recordings for years now, daily, along with writing on a daily basis. But I've never put my writing out there, and I've never really put my recordings out there. But I think that when you do that, you attune yourself in a much more heightened way, because there's something in us that thrives in regards to that kind of connection. And yet, what are those beliefs that I had to challenge that have led me here? That have led me to saying something like subjectivity is overrated, and then suggesting earlier that what we call realism or naturalism doesn't mean anything in itself inherently. Well, it's because I suppose, just like anyone else, I'm attempting to tie together as much as I can and make my thinking as organized as I can, and to sort of work out the most coherent picture of reality that I can, having broken it down for as long as I can. And you could say, obviously, as a lot of people say, that philosophy has a dual function. One of those is to take apart and the other is to put together. And in many ways, most people only take away from their education in philosophy the first idea, which is that philosophy is a form of skepticism. And it certainly is. I think that in many ways there's two philosophers that we in many ways haven't gotten beyond in philosophy, and I think that they're philosophers of which to me are instrumental in how I even philosophize, not in terms of the substance of my beliefs, but the very methods within which I work. And those are the ancient philosopher Sextus Empiricus, and the second is David Hume. And so just those names alone will in many ways lead a lot of people to not listening to me, but I suppose that over time I will explain myself more fully, because at the same time these are two philosophers that are only one half of philosophy, because although Sextus Empiricus ultimately teaches us to practice a kind of skepticism that is more viciously and critically skeptical than anything we could practice. It's the kind of skepticism that presses the mind to its outer reaches. And in David Hume, you have another kind of thing happening that's similar, but much more oriented towards our modern quote-unquote condition, even though David Hume was writing in the 1700s. And so what I mean to say is that the capacity, and by the way, David Hume, what was most important about him is his critique of induction and his critique of traditional epistemology. And I don't think we've gotten beyond David Hume because we can't simply challenge him with an idea, because what he's ultimately pointing us to is our own independent capacity to sense and reason, and to do so in such a way that is modest and experimental. And what does that have to do with taxi driver? Well, I think that when you practice the kind of skepticism that philosophy is really about, which is the most vicious kind of critique in the name of the truth, you ultimately are at a point where, whether or not you want to, you will have to make sense of your life. You'll have to make sense of existence. You'll have to put the pieces together, because there's a sense in which, given, as I said, the facticity and the thrownness of our lives, there is a sense in which a part of that facticity and thrownness, and to build also on what Nietzsche had called useful errors, there is a sense in which we are having to affirm something. And I think Aristotle also understood this, that there's something that we have to affirm. And yet I don't think it's an idea. I don't think it's self-consciousness itself that is to be affirmed. I think it's actually simple, what they call simple consciousness, which is a way of denuding the sensory. And intellectuals traditionally almost function as if they don't even have bodies. And a part of that has to do with the professional side effects of philosophizing. But another has to do with the fact that they ultimately would be out of jobs if they were to see what the implications of their ideas are, or if they were to live through the implications of their ideas. And so the thing that I mean to say is that if we practice skepticism on the one hand, which means challenging all those cliches that we think we have about what it means to be alive, or what it means to be a human in a modern city, or to be broken by having come out of the Vietnam War or coming out of trauma, if you were to automatically interpret all of that in terms of some scheme, some framework because of some movies that you saw or some book you read, you're ultimately yourself enslaving yourself to that ideation, to that idea, to that ideology. And it's not as if I myself were free from all of that. It's just that if you don't challenge it, you'll never experience the kind of opening that is necessary. The opening of, how do you call it? The opening of your mind, the ego death, the opening of the heart. I like to think of it as being sensory, and hence the cool liquidity of the nighttime atmosphere when the cicadas are starting to come and there's that edge of violence in the air. I think it's then that I have another sense of what I am, because you don't know who I am. At least most of you don't who are listening, and you don't know what my reality is. Neither is it important, because it would take too long to begin talking about here. And so what I mean to say is that this cliche about the disaffected individual, whether it's the figure in Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea or Taxi Driver, or even movies like The Joker, which is a kind of cliche that you see more and more, which is the cliche of the figure who's quote unquote breaking out of the boundaries and challenging societal norms, even if it means hurting individuals, or the trope about the gangster, you know, or the cowboys and the gangsters. You know, those are tropes, those are identities that we end up living out. And it happens all the time. No one is free from the degree to which your own cognition, your own mind is shaped by your culture that you're born into. And so I suppose that on a certain level, that's what I mean by there being a need to challenge all that. And so the question then is, what do you replace it with? Because I think that one thing I've seen over time, and it's just a simple little stupid idea, but it's that when you challenge ideas, a lot of people want to replace those ideas with other ideas. In the sense that when you give up one ideology, like if it's like hedonism, like pursuing pleasure, and you somehow overcome that, like you overcome great drug addiction, it's easy to become hyper-religious, to replace that obsession with another kind of obsession. And on a similar level, when we let go of like our religious beliefs, it's easy to hold on to scientific beliefs and to miss the realization that you're in many ways sublimating one for the other. And so the question is, what else is there? Well, I think what else is the dazzling plenitude of ordinary life. I think that there's a sense in which when you practice skepticism and then you learn how to affirm your own life, I think it then begins to speak to you, because it's speaking in a language that is truly other. And you know, that's the very danger of ideas, is that you're very rarely dealing with the real difficulty of life, because ideas tend to buttress themselves. They tend to build walls around themselves, and that is so that they can't be challenged. And my position is one that it is worth the challenge, because when you just begin to see life for what it is, and to see people for what they are, and see them as realities in the most objective sense, that they're not names, they're not families, they're not associated with your own judgments, they're not associated with your own calculations or your own pity or your own praise. None of that means anything in regards to the specific reality of a person and their personality. And so that is what is the most miraculous in people, is the tendency towards wild eccentricity in so many. And I think that if you're the kind of person that's looking for meaning in life, it begins with that ability to not only think, but to taste and test and feel, and to see that when you are able to relax, that life begins in many ways to reveal itself. And when you practice that kind of quietude, which I myself have begun to practice in the last couple of years, and it's a kind of quietude that is rooted in what I mentioned earlier, which has to do with the rhythms and routines of a regular life. I find that when I can relax into my life and forget about myself, ultimately to forget about my own subjectivity, the objective world isn't an idea. It's something that is full and complex and beyond me. But when I let it in, there's more that comes out of me, and it's as if I change in relation to that. And so a lot of people who are apparently open-minded, they say that if the facts change, that they will change their mind. But many people don't change their minds, not as if they are aware of it, but because they can't let go of the very pleasures that come with their suffering and their subjectivity. And so you could say also that a part of the pleasure in life, the whole meaning in life, is in the density of that subjectivity, and that's what life is about. But what is that subjectivity, you know? And what is the objective? It's not as if there were a neat separation between the two. And in fact, much of what we call the subjective is pre-reflective. Because I think the thing about subjectivity is that it's not only thoughts, it's thoughts about thoughts. And so what we call reason is self-conscious thinking, and that in itself is a function of subjectivity. And that in itself is connected to what used to be called passions or feelings. And feelings are often understood to be a part of subjectivity, but in many ways we automatically have responses to the world that's sort of built into our bodies. And so what I mean to suggest is that subjectivity emerges in lieu of the particular shaping of that self-awareness that must be related to culture, to use a shorthand word. And I think that what we call objectivity is hugely betrayed and lost, because the objective is actually the fullness of the immediate world around us, and people and things that can be shaped, they can be changed, that when we become active participants in our own reality, we can begin to augment and be augmented by. And so there's a sense in which this very objectivity is us, because the subjective is much more ephemeral. It's much more of an instrument. In fact, you could say that part of the mind that I described earlier as being cognition, as being rationality, is simply a function of our own animalism. It's a function of our own bodies. And it isn't this thing that gives us access to reality outside of ourselves. So reason can't be understood to be a transcendental thing that gives us any kind of certainty or anything like that. It's a very powerful thing, and in fact, learning how to think in a rational, speculative way is ultimately the philosophical methodology which no one can escape so long as you're speaking philosophically, because that's rooted in Plato and the way that Plato shaped philosophical discourse. And so you could say that Plato ultimately shaped subjectivity in a certain fundamental way that we've been wrestling with and contending with, all the while using for 2,500 years. Now, I keep saying things that are off the track, you know, and I think that circularity is a part of my own thinking, because a lot of what I'm doing is circling back and circling into and sort of explaining things in tension, all the while revolving in a way that is counterfactual or counterpunctual. Is that the word? And not as if I were trying to sound cute or trying to sound smart, but that thinking ought to be pleasurable, if it is to be anything at all. And a part of what I enjoy is the pleasure in hearing myself speak. And you could say that my own turning, my own changing, if there is such a thing as changing and turning, has occurred in those moments of solitary walking that I've been taking throughout most of my life, and usually at night. It's only in the last couple of years that I've begun doing my walks during the day. And as I deal with my own little foot issues, I've been able to walk a lot less than I used to and run a lot less. And so I think that allows me to have a deeper kind of appreciation for what walking is. Because the very rhythm of my feet seems to go hand in hand with the movement of my mind. And there's something like passages that we're taking. And so even what you think of as being darkness of life and depression and despair, that in itself is a passage. I think it's a passage to another world. It doesn't mean anything metaphysical. It simply means that you shouldn't assume it to be permanent or to be personal, you know, in the sense that getting out of that thinking of everything as being personal or that everything is permanent, that's what it means to shake off your subjectivity. Because when you think objectively with your senses, it's not as if time disappeared, but one has a sense in which if the terrorizing fear of time past and time future, or the tyranny of the mind, if it's to be dealt with, it's ultimately to dealt with not directly but indirectly. And that indirection has to do with relaxing into your life and using your mind as much as you can to feel and to think and to imagine, but ultimately not letting it get in your own way. Being a body, being in the world, there's so much that's here for you. And so in order to have it, you have to use both hands. And I think that's what is meant by there being a balancing act. And it's why we have symmetry. And the subjective and objective have to be balanced out. And I think that's a part of the theme that I'm making here, is that, you know, subjectivity not only has its historical roots in Plato, and not only was subjectivity in the way that we think of it as understanding and control rooted in Descartes, it's ultimately overrated in the sense that our ability to be rational and to feel and to imagine is secondary to life and to other people and to a world that isn't just like a stage where we're the performing act, you know. In many ways, most of us have a non-speaking role. And when you relax into that, that's when the specificity of the world starts to have another kind of meaning. At least I'm reflecting from my own experience in making this passage, in passing through these streets. And I don't know why I thought of Taxi Driver starting out. Perhaps it's because I saw that movie the other night, and perhaps it's because I loathe that type of individual, you know. I loathe the German fascist as much as I loathe the French nihilist, and yet I'm conscious of my own Americanism, but not so conscious as to be blind to its underlying power and its capacity to open up the fullness of reality itself. And so that concludes my little nocturne for whatever day this is. I'm John Edward Willie, and I'm signing off.